So my name is Clayton Lavallin, and I'm going to talk about a new approach to community development that Sarah Thorne and I have been developing here in Brazil called ReImagining Communities. Now, ReImagining Communities is a method for working with the imagination in order to transform communities. The approach begins with the inquiry into the image that the community has built up of itself over time, and it works with this image to see how that limits or could help develop opportunities for community development. This image is then renegotiated by and for the community in order to generate new opportunities for social transformation. So the approach that we're talking about today, this method, has come out of a 2-day workshop that was held here in Sao Paulo, in this very hotel in fact, on the 21st and 22nd of September of this year. Sarah Thorne and I worked on a series of methods through that workshop with the imagination in order to support communities to make the transition to more sustainable and equitable futures. So in the workshop we looked at some of the scenarios that are currently being promoted about sustainability and about the move to a more low-carbon future. And what we find is that often these scenarios are focused solely on techno-fixes or policy solutions and don't really focus on the shifts in consciousness or changes in political or economic structure that we would need in order to make that transition. Now, the approach itself is developed out of 2 key strands. One is social sculpture, and the other is asset-based community development. Sarah Thorne is a master's graduate in social sculpture, which I'll tell you more about in a moment, and I'm a community development officer at Oxford City Council, and so we were trying as much as possible to bring together the 2 types of work in this new approach. Now, social sculpture is an extended concept of art which was advocated by the conceptual artist Joseph Beuys, who created the term social sculpture in order to illustrate his ideas about art's potential to change society. Now, this was most effectively captured in his phrase, creativity equals capital. In social sculpture, artwork includes all human activity. It strives to structure and shape society in ways that use language, thought, action and object. So in fact we are all artists, we are all changing society in creative ways all the time, whether we realise it or not. In asset-based community development there's a very similar approach. It's a methodology that seeks to uncover and to bring out the best of what we have already in our communities. So it looks at the community as a series of assets. Our skills, our knowledge, our resources and our expertise are all assets that we can draw on and build upon in transforming our societies. And so in that way, everyone is both an artist, but also everyone can contribute. In the workshop, we worked with a series of principles, which can also be seen as paradigm shifts or transitions that we'd like to encourage people to bring about in their communities. One of those is the political. We were talking about how we can shift our behaviours and our relationships from competitive models to more cooperative models. And that is reflected in society in structures that encourage self-management and cooperation in the form of cooperatives. We also looked at the philosophical level, at how we can shift our thinking and our worldviews from a reductionist view, which breaks the world into parts and looks at it in a series of specialisms, to a more holistic view, which treats the community as a whole and looks at how it's developed over time. In the economic sphere, we were trying to encourage a shift from the assumption of scarcity, which we see in our current societies. We're always worried about not having enough, about scarce resources, about having to compete for them. What we'd like to do is to encourage people to think about what we have in abundance, as we have in the natural system. Everything that is given to us by nature is a gift that we can share and that we can develop from its abundance. And one of the key thinkers that we looked at in relation to this is somebody called Charles Eisenstein in his work Sacred Economics, which looks at the gift economy and the abundance in the economic sphere. We were also looking at the shift in the social sphere from deficit-based to asset-based community development. So looking instead at the problems or what's missing in a community or what's lacking, we're trying to encourage people to think about what you already have in your community that you can build upon and develop. So looking at the assets in the people, in the places and the infrastructure in those communities. And one of the key methodologies for this was looking at appreciative inquiry, which is a method that starts with what is best, what is working the best in a community, and then starts from there to develop it. And finally, in the psychological sphere as well, because we're working with imagination particularly, and how we can change and transform things within the imaginative faculty, we looked at how we can shift from what is actual in our communities and the current situations to what is possible. So working with the imagination particularly, and the skills that are related to the imagination, but also at visioning, at reimagining and revisioning what our communities could look like in the future. Now, the framework that we developed can roughly be broken down into the I5 kind of framework. So starting off with identifying the image that the community has developed over time of itself. Now, the way that we can do this is to start off with a series of interviews, discussions, and dialogues with community members, looking with the community, with support from facilitators, about how the image they've created of themselves as a community has developed over time, both in the past and in the present, and how we can change it in the future. Secondly, we want to interpret that image and work with the imagination in order to see how we can change that image, how we can reform our sense of ourselves and our identity in order to be more proactive and more positive about the way that we can develop in the future. Thirdly, we look at imagination specifically, so exploring alternative images and reimagining possibilities. Once the limiting aspects of the image that we've identified have been looked at and analysed, we can look at how we can change that image and work with our sense of ourselves and our communities to free up more skills and expertise to improve things in the future. And then, moving into the last two stages, these are mostly influenced by social sculpture, so it starts to become more practical. It's about the intervention that you can make in the community. And it's about finding the appropriate forms and developing those in a social, aesthetic sense, and also looking at political and economic structures in order to see how that vision, that image that we've created, can be fulfilled in practice in our community. And then finally, we'd want to initiate that. We'd want to change that intervention, we'd want to make the changes and transformations happen in the community. And we'd see this as an active expression or manifestation of that reimagined vision that we have. So this can be broken down roughly into about 3 key stages. So starting off with identifying the image itself that we currently have of our community, working through to the imagination, so the image that we have, and reimagining that, and then through to the appropriate forms that we can use to help transform that community. Now, in order to take this process through to its fruition, we need a lot of practical skills, and the training looked at how to cultivate those skills. So in the workshop, we looked at how to cultivate listening skills, for example. Listening both in the sense of on a one-to-one basis, but also how we can use methodologies and different approaches in order to listen to groups as a whole as well. And particularly observation. We were looking at how we could use techniques drawn from Gerentian observation, which is a form of observation that was developed by Goethe on his studies of holistic science. Going through to the second stage about imagination and reimagination, we also particularly looked at the power of visions, about the stories that we tell about ourselves, and about how we can retell those stories. Often communities that have been oppressed take on the stories and the narratives of the oppressors, and then reproduce those power structures through the stories they tell themselves about who they are. And so we want to challenge those, and we want to look at how those narratives and those stories and those images can be reformed. And then finally, in the form and transform stage, we really want to look at techniques of how people can work together to co-create the new structures and the new forms that we need, and also how they can work together in order to communicate and to work more effectively through facilitation also. Now, as well as a series of practical skills, this method also requires a series of practical techniques to bring this into fruition. So in the workshop, we looked at a series of techniques that have been tried and tested across the world in order to work with community groups that develop them. Some of the ones we looked at in the identifying the image stage were methodologies such as open spaces, appreciative inquiry, and also forum theatre. We had the opportunity to get up and interact in forum theatre to look at some of the situations that we wanted to tackle. And it's a very interactive and enjoyable way, really, to look at those issues. We also wanted to use methodologies that help people to imagine and reimagine their communities. So some of the methodologies that we used were the World Cafe method, Dragon Dreaming, for instance, from Deep Ecology, and also Future Search. These are all different ways in which you can look at our current ideas, but also look at future developments also. And then finally, in the form and transform stage, we didn't look at any particular existing methodologies because we think it's very important that as part of this process, you develop your own forms as part of this final stage, so the forms themselves come out of the image that you've identified and the content that's related. So thank you very much for spending the time to talk to me today. If you'd like to find out more, please do go to the ReImagining Communities section of the ReCivitas website. The workshop that we undertook here was organised by ReCivitas, so I very much recommend that you look at their work and you take the time to familiarise yourself with that. So thank you very much.